here with you all at the 4th International Conference. I can empathise totally with Joanne and everything that she's gone through in terms of planning the event, and I really congratulate her on the very smooth first day of the way things have actually gone. It's my privilege here to actually introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon. JoseMarie Griffiths is Dean and also Professor, obviously, at the School of Information and Library Studies, SILS, at the University of North Carolina, here in Chapel Hill. She's got a very distinguished research and leadership career that spans more than 30 years. And ultimately, from her undergraduate education, has a science background, which I'm sure has fed very much into the approach that she's taken within the profession. She has a BSc in physics, and then also a PhD in information science from the University College of London. The major research themes that Josie has been involved with focus very strongly on the design, analysis, integration and the economics of information and library systems. She's done some work into the return on investment analysis of library systems and information systems, which I think was raised this morning as one of the key issues in terms of evidence-based practice. She's also looked at the whole concept of information sharing across organisations. And again, that's already been drawn upon as a key theme in terms of the amount of collaboration and the opportunities for interaction, not only within your own organisation, but beyond that, regionally, nationally, and then internationally. And I must confess that's one of the extra angles that has brought me here to North Carolina. I'm undertaking some research in Australia into some of the workforce planning issues, and of course I've got two wonderful contacts here in North Carolina to be able to share some of those ideas and to maybe look upon you as mentors in terms of what we're trying to achieve in Australia. Back to Josie. She's got numerous national and international activities going on in her own right. She's the member of a number of commissions, boards, panels and associations. She's recently been appointed to the United States National Science Board and has also been on the President's Information Technology Advisory Committee. She's held a number of significant leadership roles within various professional associations and is on the editorial board of a number of academic journals. So, to be honest, she's an absolutely eminent person here to talk about some of the issues that are part of our keynote today, substantiating the value of library and information services, collecting the evidence to tell the real story. So I'll hand over to Josie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This afternoon I'm going to be putting on my researcher hat. And I do have to say that I think that having spent a lot of my research career gathering data and developing new methods for gathering and analyzing and presenting data, that this conference is right up my street. I'm going to talk today about really the culmination of a series of studies that started in 1982, looking at the value of library and information services. And today I'm going to use a case study, and the case study is actually going to come from the public library sector. Is there anybody here from the public library sector? So this might be interesting for all of you. The public library presents some particular challenges in looking at value and return on investment. It's a little bit easier to some extent in corporate and academic and medical and professional environments. So I'm going to talk about components of measuring return on investment in libraries. And the case study is going to be from the state of Florida, looking at public libraries in the state of Florida. I'm going to talk about the methodology we used and developed, which built on the work developed in the special library community. What we did to validate and process the data, some of the results and how we presented them, and then communicating the results to stakeholders. I have more PowerPoints than I can share with you today, so I'll be flicking through some quickly. But in agreement with Joanne, we decided to keep it as an integral whole because it will then be put on the website, and some of those data where we're looking at how we project from one population to another, you can actually study the tables if you wish to do so and look at them. So I'm really, just bear with me as I flick through a few a little bit more quickly. So components of measuring return on investment. Well, There have been, actually, return on investment studies are not new, but they've come under many different names. Cost-benefit analyses, cost-effectiveness analyses, value studies, impact studies, and then more recently we've seen the term return on investment used as organizations and institutions have been asked to be more accountable, particularly in the public sector, which isn't the traditional environment where we've seen these kinds of studies engaged. In the for-profit sector, these kinds of studies are fairly common. One looks at investments, one looks at returns, one looks at impact on bottom line, etc. And now we're beginning to see the push for libraries, museums, schools, colleges, parks, etc. And just recently, I was asked by one of the officials at the university, how can we demonstrate the return on the investment in the state's investment in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill? And there are ways, and I said if we can do it for libraries, we can certainly do it for academic institutions. So the importance of ROI for libraries and information systems is that budgets are tight. There are competing federal, state, and local interests, particularly in the public sector. In the private sector, the question that's typically asked by a CEO or a chief research officer is, I don't know if the investment we're making in our library or our internal information organization is enough. I don't know how much we should invest, and I don't know what success means. And I found that in the library and information world, and I found it in the IT world equally. So comparing the investments, they're not necessarily always similar, but nobody quite seems to understand what they're expecting. It's important to make the case in both quantitative terms and anecdotal terms. We've seen a lot of libraries are collecting anecdotes, good comments from users and so on, but you really need to have both. It's not one or another, but increasingly both. The quantitative terms give you a sense of the scope of the kind of response that you're getting to the services that you provide. The anecdotal evidence provide context, and so they're both very, very important in making a case. Economic valuation is a powerful tool for advocacy, and researchers tend not to do advocacy very well. We stop at the report, the publication, and hope that others will advocate, and it doesn't always happen. And so I'm going to advocate a more of an advocacy approach on the part of those people who are conducting research in all areas, but it's important. And data must be collected and analyzed in the context of what's important to the community that you're trying to reach, or the audience that you're trying to reach. In Florida, they had conducted a number of statewide studies. There was a statewide plan for economic development. And tourism is a big area in Florida. We did a similar study later in Pennsylvania. Tourism is important in parts of Pennsylvania, but not necessarily all of Pennsylvania. So you have to look at the environment in which you're conducting a study. Why ROI is more difficult to calculate for libraries, actually more difficult in the service sector. Well, we have to try and quantify benefits or outcomes that vary from use to use, that vary from user to user, because it's a very subjective notion, what are the benefits, and from library to library as services vary. And the push for libraries, especially public libraries, to develop services relevant to the needs of their local communities has made the evaluation process more difficult, because there's constant pressure for change and adaptation and responsiveness, and it's very difficult for libraries to continue to adapt their evaluation mechanisms as quickly as the environment in which they're operating is changing and expecting to change. And so libraries have tended to focus on user satisfaction and other attitudinal measures. Now, the first thing I should tell you about the value assessments was a series of studies done by Don King and King Research, and I was a part of that team. The first major one we did really was in 1982 for the Office of Scientific and Technical Information of the Department of Energy, and we were asked to develop approaches to assess and measure the value of the energy database, the contents of the energy database, which was an accumulation of information about technical reports that were funded by the Department of Energy. In conducting that research, we talked to economists around the country about approaches to measuring value, and came up with a methodology that was that seemed appropriate to the economists that we interacted with. And we talked about 3 levels of value assessment. One is the willingness to pay, this economic notion of what are you willing to pay for something, except in terms of a library and information service that was measured very heavily in terms of user time. That user time is a scarce resource, and if you're willing to spend your time doing something, then that's an indication of value. It's what Herb Simon called attention economics. It's the extent to which you pay attention to a particular thing. But then we also realized that the time spent using a service is just one component, and there's actually a benefit or a value derived from that use. You get information, it helps you in some way, we hope, and that can be valued as well. So we talked about a use value. And then the third thing is we talked about a consequential value, which is what's the consequence of having used that information? What happened? Did you do your work better? Were you able to do something you couldn't do before? So we had these sort of three levels of value in the early 1982 phase. And that study led to a series of studies in special libraries, in government libraries and corporate libraries in particular. The only problem was that most of the results were contained in proprietary reports to the individual agency or the corporation, because people did not want the value of their product or service to be made public. What was interesting was several of our clients came and said, we'd like to know what others are doing, and we actually used to have sort of meetings of several of our clients who were willing to have us share the data and sort of compare them against each other. And subsequently, we got permission from most of the organizations that we had worked with to publish the cumulative results, to average the results, and that resulted in a Special Libraries Association publication, a book. Then we looked at, we'd also been doing work with public libraries and actually with K-12 school libraries. And we did do some early valuation of public libraries. In 1989, we did a study of UK public libraries. In 1991, we did a study of Massachusetts libraries. We did all types of libraries in Massachusetts, but in that was one of the early studies to estimate the value of public libraries as well as school libraries, as well as academic and special libraries in Massachusetts. In 1993, we were asked to do a UK policy briefing on the value of libraries, and we wrote a chapter that was published in a book. This was a lecture series. The lecture became a chapter in a book that was focused on libraries and public policy, and the article was on public libraries, the undiscovered national resource. It's interesting enough that that was subsequently the basis, along with some other studies we did for parts of the British Library, for the more recent return on investment study that the British Libraries conducted. It wasn't completely the same, but there are elements of the methodology we discussed here and used for the British Library R&D department, where we did a return on investment study. We needed to create an aggregate picture of library value rather than just individual use by use value. And then we needed to compare this to the total investment in libraries to come up with a return on investment. Then more recently, electronic publishing, digital libraries, new technologies have changed and changed the picture and added a whole new dimension. So we now have to look at investment in usage of electronic and print collections and services, and this impacts the investment strategies of the usefulness and value of alternatives. So there's a whole new layer of complexity added as a result of the efforts to automate and digitize and maintain various services. So it's changed both the investment and the outcomes. We need to look at costs, outputs, and outcomes. These are all important. Return on investment. Remember, we have to look at costs or investments of the libraries and their services, and this is where I find a lot of organizations break down. They don't always know what it costs to deliver various kinds of services. So you can look at a return on investment study for a particular service, or you can look across all services, or you can look across a sector, and many different levels at which you could do it. You want to look at the outputs produced with those investments. What are you actually producing? And then you have the use of those outputs. And while you can control the outputs you produce, you can't fully control the use Okay, so there's actually a little disconnect there between the outputs produced and the usage. You hope that there's a good correlation. That's presumably what you look for when you're looking at who uses your services and what they say about the services when you do ask them, and do they keep coming back. And then outcomes resulting from that use can be improved quality of life, or support from lifelong learning, or support for the community's economy, and so on and so forth. There's a range of first order, second order, third order outcomes as a result of use of libraries and libraries information services. And then finally, you can measure these things from any number of different perspectives. Outcomes can be looked at from the user community perspective, the total community served, which is the user community and the non-users in that community. And I find it always very good to get a sense of the users and the non-users, because the non-users may be using alternative services that might be delivering something better, something more economical, etc. And then the funding decision makers is another key perspective. So a lot of the studies we've done have typically been done to address multiple communities at the same time. It's because we like to do big studies. And then the total economic value. This came from a study. One day as we were approached by the state of Florida, and I was preparing the proposal, and I was sitting in Pittsburgh and looking at the Sunday newspaper, and on the back page of the newspaper I saw a report of a study that was done looking at the assessment of the value of the scenic views in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Now, why this jumped off the page at me, I don't know, but it did, and I got very excited, and I thought, aha, this is really quite interesting. We're talking about putting a value on library and library services, and somebody else is talking about scenic views. How do they do that? So I contacted the researchers, who it turned out were former colleagues of mine at the University of Tennessee Business School and Environmental Sciences Department, and they'd actually developed approaches to looking at economic value. And they had survey instruments that they gave to the people who visited the park and so on. Anyway, we wrote the proposal. We got the study in Florida, which was to look at economic return on investment. So I have to be very clear. Anything I'm saying is only economic return on investment, not social return on investment, not community return on investment, not educational return on investment. And it's very hard to get people in Florida to understand that there are many other kinds of environments in which we could look at return on investment. But we gathered together a set of economists, the ones who had done the study in the national park, and an economist from Florida who had done return on investment in an early warning hurricane early warning systems, and so on. And we gathered them all together and talked about the different methodologies we use to assess value and returns in various things, and sat there with the stakeholders, the State Library of Florida, who was funding the study, members from their board, and members from representing public libraries around the state, to actually conduct a workshop to say, there are a range of approaches that we could use. And we're not the only people who have an approach, so we had an approach, but we presented it as one of many. And then actually crafted an approach to looking at return on investment for Florida libraries, and that was quite an interesting exercise in and of itself. One of the things we had also done was take a look at what was happening in Florida, given that was the environment into which our study results had to go, and say what kinds of return on investment studies are being passed around in the state of Florida. And we discovered that the University of South Florida, their Center for Economic Development, had published a series of studies which looked at the impact of, well, for example, the location of a hospital in a particular community, or the value of the Tampa Zoo to the economic value of the Tampa Zoo to the local community. So we looked at those studies as well, and we looked at the methods they use, and we discovered that they'd been using a software package which uses an input-output econometric model called Regional Economic Models, Inc., from a company called Regional Economic Models, Inc., but the model was called Remi. And we decided to adopt that model in addition to the methodologies that we had developed in the workshop. And it was really quite interesting, because even when we had finished our study and we were presenting it to key decision makers, politicians, legislators, city managers, county managers, etc. in the state of Florida, They were sort of interested with the results until we mentioned that we had actually adopted the Remi model. And when we suddenly mentioned that, then they gave the study results credibility, that we had used what they were familiar with in the studies they'd seen of other economic decisions and decisions they were making to attract businesses or invest in certain resources in the state. So understanding the culture in which the return on investment studies are being done is very, very important. And so we couldn't have imagined just how important that decision actually was. And what they did was they measured the impact on jobs and job created, the impact of an investment in personal income, the investment in whatever it was they were measuring in personal income, and in local output. And so we were able to add to our general return on investment study the impact that the public libraries had on these areas. Okay, so that hadn't been done before, not very much anyway that I'm aware of. And we used an approach called contingent valuation, and every study that we looked at, particularly in the library and information science sector or library and information services sector, are tending now to say that contingent valuation is the way to go. Now, there are some controversies over contingent valuation, but it's an economic method of evaluating for goods and services on which it's hard to put a price. Okay, it's not already priced, and therefore you're looking at what's going on. And it looks at the implications of not having the goods or the services. So we looked at the implications if the public libraries weren't there. What would people do? Where would they go? And the contingent valuation is the net, is the difference between the costs and the benefits with the libraries in place and without the libraries in place. Okay? And then the Remi model took this and modeled it forward and projected it over the next 15 years, I think. The Remi model said what monies are changing hands. So libraries employ people. Those people have an income. Some of that income is disposable. The libraries also employ contractors and services from within the community. That creates revenue, which creates jobs, which creates income. And so that all cycles around, and they follow the flow of funds from the libraries into multiple sectors. So the publishing sector, the IT sector, the construction sector, etc., and see what happens over time. And it's like an economic ripple effect to see what happens just by virtue of having a library in your community. How does it ripple economically through the community? So we did that. This case study. Where's my watch? Okay, we're doing well. Methodology. Okay, well, Florida's public libraries were recognized as active community participants with a wide range of services. Florida had undergone a major 15-year expansion in building public libraries as more and more people were retiring down to Florida, coming from other parts of the United States where they expected better library services than Florida had had in the past. So libraries had sort of become known and were doing very well. But there was little known about how Florida libraries contributed to their users, to the communities, and to the state, and particularly no information really on how they contributed economically. So we conducted this study from 2003 to 2004, basically in 2004. We used a variety of data collection and analytical methods, including the data that the state libraries, that the libraries reported to the state library, their annual data. We went back 10 years so that we could identify trends, and that gives information on collection, staffing, expenditures, services, usage, etc., etc. We conducted a statewide household telephone survey of adults, anyone aged 18 and over. That was getting to both identifying people who both used public libraries and people who didn't use public libraries. We did an in-library survey of people who visited the library, adults who visited the library, and that allowed us to get more information about what people did when they visited the library. The household survey gave us people who visited in person and people who visited remotely via the internet, and we were able to ask questions about both kinds of usage. We then went back to the libraries to ask them some more information, particularly about usage of the libraries by children. But we asked about tourists. Some of them had quite good information on the tourists coming in and out. And we asked for information about the services that were provided that were sort of, we call them almost pass-through services, when there might be a coffee shop in the library, or copying services, or a bookstore, gift shop, whatever, those kinds of economic activities that occurred within the library. And then we used the input. We did a survey of organizations around the state. Almost forgot that one. That was important because we realized that other organizations, corporations, academic institutions, well, colleges and universities, K through 12 libraries, hospitals, etc., also were users of the public libraries. Okay, and that was an interesting survey that generated some interesting results. The heaviest users of public libraries in terms of those other organizations were university libraries, who were using the public library for interlibrary loan on behalf of the students. The students and faculty and others who came into the library, businessmen who came into the library, we caught in one or other of our surveys, but this was the library-to-library usage that we were able to capture. And then we used the input-output econometric model, Remi. Okay. So the household interviews and in-library survey, we collected information about frequency of use of the libraries, the mode of use, did they visit physically, how often, did they visit remotely, how often, the cost in terms of their time, out-of-pocket expenses, so it could be a bus fare or it could be a parking fee, the cost in terms of mileage to get there, driving, reasons for services used, reasons for using them. And what we did was we focused these questions in a critical incidence methods. So we focused and asked them typically about the last use. Okay, the last use of the public library, if they were users of the public library. That allowed us to go into more depth about what happened with their use of the library and the outcomes that they derived as a result. The organization survey was, as I say, different types of organizations, the use of public library services, their cost to use the services, cost in time, and the savings that resulted from the use of those services, predominantly in time, a little bit in some expenditures. They were able to get a resource that they then didn't have to buy or subscribe to. The follow-up survey, as I've mentioned, obtained some information about special populations using the library, tourists and school-aged children in particular. We looked at interlibrary lending and borrowing. We looked at expenditures and income, and we looked at these business-like operations run by the library, outside people or vendors. Those were not typically collected on an annual basis, although we've subsequently recommended that some of these data elements be collected on a regular basis because it gave them, in particular, the information on tourists was very, very helpful for them. And then Remi, this is the model. There are several other models like it. This is considered the best. It's sort of the ultimate. Of course, it's more expensive to use, but there are several of these kinds of models that exist that can give you additional information. And it allows us to take a look at the economic contribution of libraries beyond the actual users of the library to yield a set of direct, indirect, and induced effects to the served communities. So data validation and data processing, and this is the one I'm going to rush through a little bit because after a while it gets to be a little bit difficult. So for the telephone survey, we compared our survey estimates of population with census data from the state of Florida because we wanted to be sure that we had a representative sample. We use census data when data are distorted, and we characterize the sample by census demographics. I should say, by the way, just one comment on household telephone interviews. They are harder and harder to get good response rates. We have got a number of national surveys going on right now, and the Pew Institute has published a study on the decreasing response rates because more and more people can avoid answering the phone. So it's just harder and harder to do, and it's a big question mark in a culture that has become so familiar with telephone surveying, and we've moved towards web-based surveying, which gives you a totally different skew on the people who opt to fill out. So there are some serious questions about the future of good surveys in this country. Then we categorize by census demographics, so age, gender, household income, education level, and so on, and then estimate the population in the census ranges, and then estimate the number of users and visitors. And we give you an example, and in this particular example, women over the age of 55 were overrepresented in the sample, which actually is sort of intuitively the way we expect it. More women do tend to answer the phone, and if we're calling at certain times of the day, then certain kinds of people are likely to be home. We did try to span the surveys over time of day, day of week, and we had the Survey Research Center at the University of Pittsburgh actually conduct the survey with us, for us, I should say. And then you estimate the number of visits. I'm not going into, you can look at these tables to your heart's content. But there are two types of estimates, and that's what people often forget. There are estimates about users, how many users use the public library, how often they use the public library, and their demographics. And then we have estimates about uses, which are different. So what services are used, the purpose of use, and the outcomes of use, and you have to project those up, not to the population, but to the total number of uses. And I was just making a comment to Carol at lunchtime that a number of studies that I was recently asked to review for the Mellon Institute were all usage studies, and not a single one mentioned total amount of use. So that interpreting the proportions that were reported were done independent of understanding the scope and scale of that kind of use. It was okay, you can get something out of it, but you could have got more if you'd had a sense of total use as well. And then the estimates depend on the type of survey, so that the telephone survey, where we're surveying adults in households, the questions about individual users are fine, and we can project to the demographics, but the critical incident about uses need to be projected to the population of uses. And similarly, when we do the in-library survey, it's the questions about uses are okay because you're surveying on visits, and then you have to adjust for the user questions. Okay, so if you're doing a survey in an environment and you're asking about the people and you're asking about that visit, you have to project them to different populations. You know that clearly the demographic characteristics for the questions about individuals are relevant. When you're talking about visits or uses, you have to adjust for the frequency of visit, because the people who visit or use your service more frequently have a greater probability of being in your sample. Okay, so that's why you have to make those adjustments. So very straightforward stuff, but not always used. And so with the telephone interview, we adjusted by ranges of the amount of use, actually the frequency, the amount of use in a time period that was, so like frequency of use. Estimate the total use in each of those frequency ranges, and then estimate the use-related measure. And we've got some examples here. I will give you examples of how to do it. And we can give you the web address for the whole study results too, so that you can see the actual study, and you can look at the sort of in-depth study. And so we make more adjustments. So here we go. Sorry, I don't want to keep going through all of these because it's lots of numbers. I'm more interested in talking about the results and then how we projected, how we promoted the results. The first thing we did as we were doing our analysis and calculations is we figured that we should err on the side of caution. The great concern that we've had in looking at the value studies, it's very easy to get high values very quickly. Okay? So we wanted to be very, very cautious. So outliers, extreme results are not figured into any of the averages. We also, when we were doing the contingent valuation, we have a question that says, if the public library didn't exist, what would you do? We have a group of people who will say, well, it wasn't important enough to me to do anything else, so I wouldn't have bothered doing anything else. So we take those out of the picture. Then there was a group of people who said, well, I know I needed the information or the service, but I'm really not sure where I would go. And then we had the third group who would say, oh, well, I would go here, you know, I'd go over to the university library, or I'd go to the bookstore, and I don't actually get what I needed. And then we would ask what it would cost to do that. We didn't look and make estimates of value, contingent value, based on those people who really didn't know where they'd go, because we really didn't know where they would go. Now, we could have taken an average from the other set and bumped up the numbers, but we decided to be cautious at every single decision point, so that we could say that the numbers we came up with were a lower bound, and that we'd had a lot of confidence in the values that we presented. So what you want to try and do, you know, people will be skeptical of results. So to the extent that you feel you've got the hardest numbers you can get, the better off you'll be in making the case. So we went low about every single time. Our emphasis in presenting the results was on bottom line results. And one of the problems of researchers like me is we get very excited by gathering a lot of data, and we like to analyze the data, and we get excited by what this means, and we try and put too much into our results. I mean, I'm guilty of this as much as anyone, and the large research report, you know. But this was a study that nobody was going to read unless we actually presented the results in a meaningful way. So we were actually asked to produce an executive summary with the key results, and we were asked to make it 2 pages. Well, we didn't quite get to 2 pages. I think we got up to 8. But we did extract out the key results. So we produced a summary that was bottom line results. You want to correlate those results with the interests that are important to the people who need to see the results and the people you want to influence with the results. What's of interest to them? One of the things I often recommend, particularly if you're doing an institutional study, is that you take a result at a time and publish it in some channel of communication to your audience. So when I was CIO at the University of Michigan, we did a lot of data collection. And we managed to get a regular place in the corner of the campus newspaper. And so it came out monthly for faculty and staff. And so every month you would, and it's like the little statistic in USA Today. We could put our statistic in there with a graphic and just put one result at a time out. And people started to say, oh, it was interesting. I was looking, you know, I saw what you put in there this month. But if we tried to put out a report with all those results, it would have been too much for most people because they're not as interested as we are in what this really means. You also want to produce effective graphics and less text and numeric data. We did produce an extensive, what we called the methodological report, which we felt we were writing for the people in this room, for the most part, other researchers who'd be interested in the methodology and the detailed results and so on. But for the state, we produced a more of a summary. And we used graphics like this, where the basic return on investment out of the study was that Florida's public libraries return $6.54 for every dollar invested. They returned those to predominantly the user community and the immediate community. And we have this little graphic that shows, you know, dollar bills and so on. Very simple to do, but has a big impact. We prepared a workshop for librarians in the state on the methodology, and we came up again. This is something that most people in public libraries are not really going to slog through. So we tried to come up with visual elements. This was the final chart, but what we did is we broke down the workshop to look at every one of those elements, to say you have to do this and you come up with a number, and then you do this and you come up with a number, and you add the 2 numbers together, and then you divide those 2 numbers by something else. So this was sort of really a sort of semi-visual mathematical approach, and there's a whole workshop built off it. And you can look at it as your leisure. But we continued to look at things. The return on this was the revenue investment in Florida's public libraries. Well, who's funding public libraries? Predominantly the local environment, local communities. Federal money and state money is just a small piece of this environment. And yet a lot of people were looking at the state money as being a major piece. It's actually minor. So ultimately, this tells you something about the audience that we needed to impact, to say, here's the return on the investment you've made, local authority, local county, local city, whatever. We also looked at the total investment. On the one hand, we can say the investment from government monies going into public libraries is, you know, it looks big to public libraries. But the user investment, in terms of the user time and cost to go in and use the libraries, is always significantly larger than the funding that comes from the basic authority, whether that's the same in corporate sector, the academic sector, and the public sector. But we wanted to demonstrate that the users are also investing, that this, as I say, it's an economic factor, and it's an important factor that people should recognize. And in the public library sector, we're telling politicians whose constituencies vote that the investment in use of the public library is substantial by many of their constituencies. So more constituents than vote. So that's sort of an important thing to look at. The economic return we looked at, we had 3 elements to making up that return. The first one, the largest portion, was the savings by not having to go somewhere else. It was that contingent valuation. It was the net benefit from having the public libraries in place. Then we had, it was 15% of it would be made up of direct community economic benefits. When people use a public library, they go and they use other services in the community. And we asked them that question, and thanks to a study done by the University of Sheffield at a time when there was a library strike, we looked at the impact on local businesses when the libraries were on strike, and there was a 23% reduction in income to the local community. It was the only number like that we could find, and so we plugged in a 23% loss from that income going to the local community. And we recommended that that be studied. And in fact, subsequently with the first hurricane hit, when we had the year of the 4 hurricanes in Florida, we were asked by several public libraries, could we develop a brief questionnaire and they can ask people what the impact was of the loss of those. Unfortunately, the second hurricane hit, the third one hit, and the fourth one hit, and there was nobody there to really focus on doing a survey of this. So we stayed with the Sheffield number. And then the third component, the smaller component, is that if the libraries don't exist, then the individuals who were using the library are going to lose the benefit that they derived from having the content of the materials that they acquired from the library available to them. And so they will lose benefits there. So we sort of had this layered approach to multiple things that contribute to the economic return. Then we went to the Remi study, and the Remi study said, okay, there's this much invested in public libraries, but you know, the local governments could invest that money elsewhere. And so they looked at what happened as a result of the money being in libraries, and libraries spending money and funneling resources to other parts of the community, and what would have happened if they'd invested the money elsewhere. And ran that model for a 10 to 15 year period, and determined over that time that one new job, and one new non-library job, I should emphasize, was created for every $6,500 invested in public libraries. There was a new job somewhere else in Florida created as a result of that. Of course, if the public library directors want to know how to improve this, you spend your money in your community or your state, which may not always be feasible, but that's the notion behind this. If you invest locally, that money will feed the economy of your community or your state or your region, however you decide to do that. So jobs were created. They looked at the impact on gross regional product, which is the state equivalent of gross national product, and found a 9.08 to 1 return in terms of gross regional product for every dollar of public support going into the public libraries. And then the Remi model also looked at increase in income, disposable income, on the part of Floridians, and determined that income increased by $12.66 for every dollar invested in public libraries. Now, you can look at these numbers and say, gosh, they seem large, and I could say, well, you know, it may not be $12.66, it may be $10, it may be $15, but it gives you a sense there is a positive return, and it's not just small, okay? It's not $2 or $1.50. In addition to that, we decided that we needed to dispel some myths about public libraries. Public libraries were not well understood. At the same time, we were being asked to do this economic return on investment. I asked the Secretary of State, who was commissioning the study. She had been the mayor of Tampa. And I said, well, you're mayor of Tampa, and you've got a flourishing public library, and what did the public library do economically for your community? And she, you know, hovered around the topic for a little bit, and then finally talked about how wonderful a place it was for storytelling for children. She couldn't herself, even though she was commissioning the study, come up with any single direct relationship. But we felt we needed to give a sense of what was going on in the libraries and who was using it. And so in addition to the basic return on investment, we provided some contextual information. This is where we tend to go beyond our initial purview. So we looked at the number of visits of public libraries, and we were able to look at in-person visits and remote connections, and the remote connections didn't include children or tourists. So it's more than 94 million visits to a library in a year. The number of visitors, almost 12 million people annually visited public libraries in Florida, is about half the population. Tourists made up 29% of the people who came in to use the public libraries, and that was an astounding result, maybe not for the libraries that were in the area, but certainly for the legislators and particularly the local politicians. And then we also looked at various cost to benefit to cost ratios. I've given you the definitions. These came out of the Remi analysis. So we had 6.54 out of our basic analysis. They came 5.2 to 1 for availability, 7.2 to 1 for usage. And remember, we've come up with 6.54, so we're slap in the middle of those two. And then they looked at the benefit to cost ratio on wages, 5 to 1, and the benefits to cost ratio on GRP, 3.7 to 1. And at this point, it starts to get confusing for a lot of people because we've got a lot of ratios, a lot of different numbers, and they mean different things. And so part of what we had to do was to start to develop a taxonomy because there is no real vocabulary that we've settled upon in these kinds of studies. So we were sort of making it up as we went along, and we felt we should document what we were saying. So there's another problem as we move into this evidence-based arena, that we need to be clear about definitions and terminology. And that's something that perhaps is a project for sharing among the research community. So we had the results, and the next question was, how do we communicate these results to stakeholders? And that's where we played a little role, but actually started working with the communications people in the state library and public relations firms in the state. We derived a variety of report formats. The executive summary overview report is a short one, published in glossy print with nice color pictures and so on. The detailed methodology and analysis we made available on a CD for people. It's quite extensive. It's got everything, including all the survey instruments. Then we did some additional analysis and survey instruments. And most recently, we've been working on a return on investment calculator that will, plus a manual that will allow individual libraries to collect some of the data, not all of the data we collected, some of the data, feed it into the calculator, and based on the sort of relationships we identified in the statewide study, actually compute a return on investment for the services of that library. And that's about to go into pre-test with several libraries in Florida who've wanted to test it. When it is completed, it will be distributed free of charge through ibiblio.org, which is our sort of collection of collections, the public library that runs out of SILS. So the software and the manual will be available for any library to use. We felt that that was important. We were very cautious about releasing the methodology on individual libraries because we were concerned that they could be misused as well as used. And what happens if you don't get a very good return on investment? It doesn't mean you're not doing a good job. So interpreting what those results mean when you start looking on an individual library basis is a little bit more cause for concern. We developed a variety of presentations, including a detailed workshop, as I mentioned, for the librarians, so they understood a little bit more about the results. We prepared several documents. This was one that the State Library Communications Office prepared. It's another glossy document with lots of pictures of Florida libraries so that people in different parts of the state would suddenly see a library that they recognized, and some key results just put in throughout that document. There was also a trifold document that was produced with two other return on investment studies that were also commissioned by the Secretary of State, one for historical collections and museums, and one, I think, for parks. So libraries were in there too. Actually, the libraries did very well in that. Actually, when we delivered the first report, I have to tell you that it wasn't released immediately, and not because they didn't like the study, but because there was an argument about whether it would be published under the governor's office or under the Secretary of State. So that was sort of success in a sense, that they were fighting over who was actually going to put the study out, and in the end, the Secretary of State won. We had lots of press releases went out. The State Library Board grabbed it and used the results to make the next proposal to the legislature for public library funding. And we continue to be asked to do things in Florida as a result of this particular study. So all in all, we can't stop at the research results. Somebody else needs to take it and run with it. And as a result of this, Libraries for the Future and the Americans for Libraries Council have actually convened a workshop over the last 18 months with a group of researchers doing this kind of study using different approaches. So the St. Louis group, there's a group in South Carolina, there's somebody in New Jersey doing these kinds of studies. And we put all our methods on the table. And a report has been written. I don't think it's necessarily public yet, but there's been a report written on the different approaches to valuing public libraries. And the idea is that, and how these valuation studies lead to the development of a public advocacy campaign. And I think that is important, and it's delightful to work with people who want to take results and get them out, but want to understand what the results mean. And so they did a very nice overview, which didn't say use one study or another, but said, here are the studies, this is what they did, this is how they can be used, this is what the results mean. And that in itself, I think, has been extremely helpful. So with that, there's my website. There's a bunch of things up on the website under my name. And we'd be happy to give you the link to the Florida study. I mean, you'll get the study so that you can see it. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.